Hi everybody, I'm here at Granite City Cemetery in Oklahoma, and unfortunately I have to sit in my very hot car because the wind is just howling outside, and I don't think anything I say with my microphone outside you'll be able to hear. Now this happens to be a pretty personal visit for me, and I have relatives who are buried here in the cemetery, but I'm here also to show you a little bit of the town of Granite, Oklahoma. And there is a connection, even though this is mostly a personal video. I think you might find it interesting to know a little bit about my family and their connection to Wiley Post, who was a very famous pilot. In fact, he was the first pilot to fly solo around the world. And I'm going to tell you the story about how my great-grandfather and Wiley Post have a connection here in Granite, Oklahoma. Thanks for joining me on another trip to visit the most memorable cemeteries, memorials, and gravesites. I'm going to visit two cemeteries here today in the very small town of Granite, Oklahoma. And I'm going to start with the one in downtown Granite, which just might be the funniest cemetery in America. The little town is just up the road to the left at the base of the hills. Okay, this attraction, this Cenotaph Cemetery, is located at the corner of Mountain Avenue and Ada. And just down the street there is the main highway, which I believe was number 9. So welcome to Granite. And there's a cemetery back there. I can't believe that I came all the way to Granite, Oklahoma to visit my family. I didn't think this video would be of interest to any of you watching, or very few of you. And then I stumble upon this cemetery that I think most of you will find pretty funny. At least if you have my sense of humor. And look right behind the cemetery, look in front of the rocks, you can see the machinery that they use to dig out the granite from the quarry. And I guess they've probably been doing that since my grandmother lived here back in the 1920s and early 30s. So I'm here in Granite to visit family who are buried in the actual real cemetery here. But this is a cemetery that was put up right next to the granite quarry, which is right there. They're responsible for digging up the granite and creating many of the headstones that are placed all over the country. Now here's a little bit of information about this particular cemetery. It says, welcome to Comecos Cemetery, just for the fun of it. Established in Wichita Falls, Texas by Dr. Dan and Eleanor Roberts, their interest in cemetery memorials, their keen observations and sense of humor led them to create this unique attraction. The cemetery was originally located at the Roberts Home and Veterinary Clinic in Wichita Falls, Texas, which really isn't that far from here. Upon Dr. Roberts' retirement and the selling of their property, Comecos had a stay in Iowa Park, Texas. Dr. Roberts ultimately made the decision that his cemetery, in quotes, should eventually be returned to Granite, Oklahoma, where all of the stones had originated. This cemetery stands in honor of Dr. Dan and Eleanor Roberts, Friends Extraordinaire, dedicated November 4th, 2006 by Bill and Ellen Willis and family. As you can see, it says cenotaph on the gate. So these aren't real graves, these are headstones. I don't know, some of these are quotes from famous people like Will Rogers, who you see the portrait of behind. Great giants of the Great Plains. I'm not sure where that arrow goes to. I'll have to see if I can find out while I'm here. So these are cenotaphs, which means there's really not anyone buried here. These are just humorous epitaphs, and I can't think of anything I like more than a humorous epitaph. So live that you wouldn't be ashamed to sell the family parrot to the town gossip, Will Rogers. He was so clever, and he has a connection to this town, which I'm going to tell you about in a little bit. Here's another Will Rogers quote. I don't make jokes, I just watch the government and report the facts. Isn't that true? Pat O'Brien is buried here today. He led the life of Riley while Riley was away. I like this one. Life is like a piano. What you get out of it depends on how you play it. Just be thankful you're not getting the government you're paying for, Will Rogers. Not sure exactly what that means. I like this bench. Thinking about death is like looking at the sun. You can't stare at it, but you can glance. That's kind of perfect for my channel, don't you think? Ma loved Pa, Pa loved women, Ma caught Pa with one, in swimming. Here lies Pa, 1893. Some of these are funnier than others. I've heard this one before. A man is not complete until he's married, then he's finished. Anonymous. I was married by a judge. I should have asked for a jury. George Burns. And here lies John Yeast. Pardon me for not rising. Dear God, please help me to be the person my dog thinks I am. This is a great one. Warren Keating. At the top it says, best prayer ever heard. Yeah, so true. This one's very popular. I'm sure you've all heard this one before. Polly Weeks, I told you I was sick. Joe Jackson, great athlete. He played like a wife's divorce lawyer. He went after everything. Going to church doesn't make you a Christian any more than going to a garage makes you an automobile. Well said. So if you ever find yourself in Granite, Oklahoma, make sure and stop by this cemetery. It's right up here by the Granite Quarry. This is a tiny little town, and right here is the high school, which is much larger now, of course. But when my grandmother graduated from here in 1933, I think it was just one of those little schoolhouses. I think there were only a dozen or so students in her graduating class, and I have a picture I'll show you. Next, I'm going to drive over to the Granite City Cemetery, where I have family members buried. But on the way, I'm going to drive through town and show you a little bit of downtown Granite. And I'll also show you the front of the Granite Public School. And then I'm also going to drive by the Oklahoma State Reformatory, which is just about a mile or so from downtown Granite. And this is where my great-grandfather worked back in the 1920s and 30s. Earlier, when I was driving into town, I noticed a street sign that said the population was less than 2,000 people. Judging by this main street, it looks like it probably hasn't changed much in 100 years since my grandmother lived here. I wonder what the population was then. Maybe it was 500, maybe 1,000. I grew up in a suburb of Los Angeles, so I've never lived in a small town like this. So for me, I find it pretty appealing. So here's a marquee for the Granite Public School. So let's drive down this street and take a look at the front of the school, since I already showed you the back, which was right across the street from the cemetery. So this street here is Granite Street, and I'm going to make a right, and I see a house here on the right-hand side, or on the left-hand side here. My mom couldn't remember what the address was where my great-grandparents lived, but she said it was a big white house with a porch that wrapped around the front. So it's possible that could be the house. But then again, there are probably lots of other white houses with porches here in town. Now, my great-grandmother went to church, I think, every day, and she went to the Church of Christ. She was a Protestant, so this looks like a newer church, but this could have been the location of the church where she attended. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was across the street from where she lived. That would have been perfect for her. I'm just driving around, just taking a look at the neighborhood since I've never been here before. Or actually, I think I was here when I was around 10 years old with my grandparents and great-grandparents, or my grandmother and great-grandparents. But I don't really remember any of it. There's another White House with a big porch, so it could have been that one. I'm sure there are probably dozens here. Yeah, and this was 75 to, well, when my mom was here, it was probably 70 to 75 years ago. So, who knows what color the houses were back then. Now, this is possibly the school. When my grandmother went to the school here, I think it was just like a little schoolhouse with just a dozen or so kids. Yeah, so this is it, home of the Panthers. Okay, interesting. So definitely this wasn't here when she was here. But it's probably the same site. Now that actually looks original, so maybe that was the school. Maybe that was actually the school back then. Ray Carver Gymnasium. So before heading down the street to the Reformatory and then the next cemetery, I'm stopping for gas here at Sonny's, and regular is $2.69. That's about $1 to $2 less than I pay per gallon in California. It seems to be the only gas station in town, and it makes me wonder if back in the 1920s and 30s, if they even had a gas station here. How many people even had a car back then? I'm glad I was able to get gas, so they at least have a gas station here. Oh, here it is, Oklahoma State Reformatory. Okay, so the name of that street is Warden Street. That's appropriate. Earlier, I mentioned that my great-grandfather had a connection of sorts with Wiley Post. According to his Wikipedia page, in 1921, Post was sentenced to 10 years at the Oklahoma State Reformatory for robbery. He only served a little over a year and was paroled in 1922. And in 1934, he was given a full pardon. After his release from the Reformatory, he went on to become the first pilot to fly solo around the world. He became one of the most famous pilots in the world, but sadly on August 15, 1935, he and Will Rogers, one of the most famous entertainers in the world, died in a plane crash near Point Barrow, Alaska, in a plane that Post was flying. My great-grandfather, who's pictured here, was a prison guard at the Oklahoma State Reformatory in the 1920s and 30s. I'm not exactly sure the exact date he started, but I'm pretty sure he was there at the same time as Wiley Post. The Reformatory opened in 1910, more than 100 years ago. It also has the distinction of being the first all-male prison in the country to be run by a female warden. So I was just at the other side of the Reformatory. I guess this is the back side. And from what I was told, the cemetery is this direction. And there it is, with a white farm-style fence all the way around it. To be honest, I'm not sure I'm even at the right cemetery. The pictures that I've seen in the past, I didn't see any grass. Unless they've just added the grass, or maybe the photos were taken in the summer when everything was dried out. Interesting. And I wasn't really expecting it to be this big either, so it's going to take me a while to find my relatives, I think. Now, according to this sign, this cemetery was established in 1901. It's really windy today, as you can see, so I hope you can hear me. And as I've been walking around the cemetery searching for the grave sites of my relatives, I've spotted some pretty interesting headstones that I thought I would share with you. One of the first headstones that caught my eye was this one. I'm not really a car buff, but that looks to me like a 1960s Chevy Impala. And on the other side of the headstone, I'm pretty sure it's a 1960s Pontiac GTO. And how many of you remember the 1964 hit song GTO by Ronnie and the Daytonas? It sold over 1 million copies. Reading the epitaph, Gone Ball Gamin', it's pretty obvious that Robert enjoyed his sports and his cars and had a pretty good sense of humor. But to be honest, the Granite City Cemetery is probably the last cemetery in the country where I would have expected to see a headstone like this. But I'm definitely happy to see it. And not very far away from Robert Calhoun's headstone is the headstone of Nelson Johnson, who also apparently seemed to love his car and his motorcycle. This model car looks so familiar, but I don't know the name. Maybe one of you will know what model this is. And here's the gravesite of a University of Oklahoma fan, or possibly an alumni, but definitely a Sooners fan. I don't see many car images on gravesites, but I've definitely seen lots of sports team logos in cemeteries all over the country. And speaking of sports, Fred Herbert Willis here apparently was a very proud golfer and fisherman, among other activities. He was also a graduate of Granite High and was a quarryman here for 40 years. It's pretty safe to say that his granite headstone probably came from the granite quarry a mile or so from the cemetery, and wouldn't it be cool if he actually dug up the granite himself for his own headstone? I've seen quite a few images of horses on gravestones over the years, but not very many cows. There are even cows grazing in the pasture right next door to the cemetery, which kind of made my day since this isn't something I ever see in Southern California. So this is the very back of the cemetery, and you can see that for such a small town, this is a pretty large cemetery. And it sure has many more interesting headstones than I was expecting to find. Sadly, you can always find military graves in just about every cemetery. This is a more personal visit than usual. Hopefully you can hear me. It's very, very windy today, and my windsock over my microphone hasn't been working very well, but I'm going to try anyway. I'm here at the gravesite of my mother's sister and my great-aunt, Leila Mae Howard, and her husband Cletus Howard. I grew up with them. We had a very close family back when I was growing up. Here's a family photo from either the late 1950s or early 1960s of my great-grandparents at the top left, and my grandmother and her siblings, and a couple of the older kids. When we all got together, our complete family was at least 2 or 3 times this size. And it seemed like back then we all got together at least quarterly for a big picnic in a park somewhere. By the late 1930s, I believe, almost the entire family, at least my great-grandparents and their children, my grandmother and all of her siblings, had all moved to California, and most of them lived on the same street, and Leila Mae actually lived right next door to my great-grandparents. Here's a photo of my great-grandmother and her children, my grandmother, Leila Mae, and their brothers and sisters, all but Russell, on the day my great-grandfather died. This was taken in Bell, California, but they all grew up in Granite, Oklahoma during their formative years or wonder years back in the 1920s and 30s. Back in the 1960s, I took a road trip with my grandmother and great-grandmother, and we came to this cemetery because I remember we visited my grandmother's younger brother who died. I believe it was something like appendicitis at the age of, it was either 13 or 14. You can see he was born in 1923, so he was the baby of the family, and he died in 1937. And that's kind of interesting because I thought they all moved from, well, I know my grandmother moved to San Francisco in 1930, right after she graduated. She graduated in 1933. I think she moved to San Francisco, got married, moved to San Francisco either in 1933 or 34. And maybe the rest of the family, or at least my great-grandparents, stayed here for a number of years. So we took a road trip back in the 1960s. I was around 10 years old, and we did stop here. He had a flat gravestone at the time, so this is a newer gravestone, and I'm guessing that Leila Mae and Cletus they decided to be buried next to Russell. I only knew him as Russell Scott. I don't know, I guess maybe his first name was George, because they talked about him a lot over the years. And they moved back after my great-grandmother died up in Los Angeles. Everyone kind of scattered, and Leila Mae and Cletus moved back here to Granite, where they had met, I'm guessing, and where at least I know Leila Mae went to high school and graduated from high school. And so she lived here until she died in 2001. When I arrived here at the cemetery about an hour ago, there was one car here and someone was visiting a gravesite, and they left about 5 minutes after I arrived. So for the last hour or so, as I've been looking for my family's gravesite, I've been here all alone, and within 30 seconds of finding their gravesite, this truck pulled up and parked right next to me on the grass almost on top of their grave. An older guy then got out of the truck and stood over a grave site right by the driver's door. And I just assumed it was just another one of those weird coincidences where the only two people in the cemetery happened to be almost at the exact same grave at the exact same time. This, as you know, I've mentioned this before, happens to me almost every time I go to a cemetery. So I decided to walk around and give him his privacy and come back later, and he eventually left. Well, about an hour later, he came back again, drove around the cemetery very slowly, I guess to let me know that he had his eye on me. My guess is he's just on security patrol, but it would have been so much easier if he would have just asked me who I was looking for, instead of practically running me over with his truck as I'm standing at my family's gravesite. I guess there are worse ways to go. Since I started this video with epitaphs, I thought this would be a perfect one to end with. So many Vietnam veterans never made it home, so I'm glad to see that Harold Klopp did. His epitaph really caught my attention. For Klopp, this was the end of the conversation. For the rest of us, I hope we live to have many more. If you like today's video, you might also enjoy one of the other videos shown here. And if you'd like to be alerted when I upload my next video, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon. So until next time, thanks for sharing the memories, everyone.